Okay, it looks like we're about ready. Let me just go ahead and get this up to the microphone.
Here's this Agile thing with Mike Markey and Matt Beam.
I don't know if we'll use that or not.
Welcome, everyone.
Hey, everybody. It's another Friday. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing, Matt?
I am acceptable. It's, the weather's great, and I feel good. No complaints. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm having a good week with my client, characterized by many things have happened, and on the net they were positive. So
Fantastic.
So I'm gonna call this week largely a win.
Excellent. Yeah, I would say the same. It's, we're dealing with, at my client, we're dealing with large organizational issues, which I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say a lot of the problems that we'll be looking, well, it depends on which client we have, right? But there's a lot of clients out there that will have issues reconciling their agile system of delivery with their organizational model, broadly speaking. And so that's kind of what we're looking at is big stuff like that. What to do about it? It's a wicked problem.
It is.
Yeah.
And we excel at dealing with wicked problems.
That's what we do.
I had a person apologize to me today.
Really? What did he do?
Yesterday, actually. They apologized for being such a pain. They said, "I'm sorry, we're such a pain." And I said, "No, you don't. Do you think I chose this career because it's easy?" So if you didn't have a problem, I wouldn't be here. You wouldn't need me, right? 100%. So don't apologize for giving me an opportunity to help you. That's not where the apologies need to be.
That's how it works. So what do you want to talk about this week? Should we time box these, by the way? I feel like we should have maybe the value
timer
podcast
of some sort. Yeah. Probably. Just to contain the meandering of the discussion, it might not be a bad idea to say, hey, let's give ourselves a topic and give ourselves 10 minutes to cover it and see if we want to go on.
Set a timer for 10 minutes. 10-minute timer starting now.
I did that to somebody in a meeting the other day. I just said, hey, Siri. And all of a sudden everybody's just like, oh, gosh.
Yeah,
like everybody's phone immediately responded with that.
Can I just say, listen, the feature where you can listen for Hey Siri is mostly useless, except when my sister invokes it across a Zoom call. Then it's effective 100% of the time. Still doesn't know the information, can't do the thing, but it hears her. Yeah.
They were doing that. This guy actually had Google, so I okayed that.
Yeah.
And my phone did not respond to it, which was a blessing in disguise.
I did say, hey, Siri, didn't I? I bet I just irritated our listener. Sorry, listener.
The one listener.
It's early days here on the podcast.
I don't want to, classify us as anything right now, but there are, in the future, people will get bored with the new content and they'll rewind and look at this stuff.
And at some point, somebody will go all the way back. That's how I do podcasts. I'm a completionist.
Yeah. We tend to think in terms of, you're saying that's how you enjoy them. You always go back and fill in all the gaps.
If I find a good podcast, I'm generally interested what they, getting the whole arc of the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah. There's valuable stuff they said a year ago. So
we live in hope.
Indeed. Let's say some valuable stuff, Mike Markey. So we're talking about the project to product sort of book by Mick Kirsten, and also the overall kind of historical context that we find ourselves in as Agile coaches. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of companies in America, well, all over the world, but we're Americans. And so there are a lot of companies in our country that need to make this shift and don't appear to be moving fast enough.
They certainly don't think they are.
Yeah. So anyway, I've been reading this book and I just so I figured we needed some kind of focus. We did set a timer, by the way. We're time boxed. And there was a couple of sort of things that I found in the book. Mick Kirsten talks about 4 flow items and 4 flow metrics, right?
Okay.
So he talks about basically you build value stream networks, which are sort of a more sophisticated understanding of value streams. And then he talks about what should go through those value streams. Then he says there's 4 things. You need to anything that goes through there has to be characterized in one of these buckets. That's either features,
okay,
new development, defects, right? Bugs that have reached production, risks. So this is stuff like security, governance, compliance. You might need to do something, right, to ensure that, or debts. Any kind of impediments to future delivery, so technical debt or restructuring or whatever.
Okay.
Everything has to be sorted into those 4 buckets.
Okay.
So that you can get your hands around what are we doing here.
And those are the 4 flow items?
Yeah, the 4 types of things that can go through your value stream. So if you've got something that doesn't fit in one of those buckets, you need to do a little bit more analysis and understand what is, because if it's not one of those, then the question is why is it valuable? Why would you each one of these things, right, contributes to the health and outcomes of the org. So if you're not doing that, you should probably stop with that flow item.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. But then you also mentioned 4 metrics.
4 flow metrics. So to measure how much flow you've got or how you're doing in the value stream, you've got flow distribution. So how much of each one of those buckets do you have, right? Is it all features and no debts? If you've got a change in regulation, you might have more risk items running through, right?
Okay.
If you need to re-architect into a platform, you might have a lot of debts going through there. But so you want to understand the proportion of how many features, defects, risks, and debts do you have at any one time. Make sure it's appropriate for your goals.
Okay.
That's flow distribution. Flow velocity is how much stuff total in a given period of time.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward. Flow time is kind of like cycle time. It's basically when it goes into the cycle, the value stream to when it goes out. Not sure why they don't talk. I guess it's because we've got the flow theme. They don't want to call it cycle time because it's about flow, but it's flow time. Flow load is basically WIP. How many things are you doing at once?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then flow efficiency.
That is 5 things. There are 5 metrics in your 4 metrics.
Oh God! Thank you so much. Here's an example of agility. I just screwed up, and we found out quickly. So there's 5 flow metrics. Let me change the document.
There are 5 flow metrics.
And so that's
here I was thinking there are 4 letters in the word flow. There's 4 of these, 4 flow metrics, 4 flow. This is going to be great. It's like the 4 Scrum events. Yeah. Except there's 5. Yeah.
Honestly, when I created this document, I was like, oh, that's such a neat symmetry. That's so elegant and parsimonious, and it's wrong. It's wrong. So anyway, I think you can see that it feels like like you're using a lot of the concepts and terms that we've had before, like cycle time flows into this, distribution, all that stuff from the different frameworks. This seems to encapsulate it. There's one more thing I want to get to, and then we'll just open it up for the last remaining 20 seconds of our time box. The idea of product modeling. So the whole idea behind, not the whole idea, but the thing you want to do is model all of your stuff, right? And make it relevant to the business, right? You want the business to understand what IT is doing and why. And so how do you measure all of that end-to-end flow? The idea is, so how do you basically, because you're you're organized into value streams to focus on products, right? Mm-hmm. How do you measure the impact of that product or all the stuff in the value stream that's going to that product when you've got different systems in the value stream, right? So some people might be doing work in Jira, and some people might be doing, these are all things that contribute to the product. They're all part of the value stream, but they're different artifacts under the covers. Like IT is using Jira, and they're using ServiceNow, and they're using Trello, and whatever they're using, right? But there's different parts and different groups in different parts of the value stream might be using these different systems. And so the idea of product modeling is to say, you're going to abstract out the relevant data for each one of those and integrate them into a product model that the business can say, oh, that's the right mixture of stats, risk, defects, features. I'm okay with the throughput, right?
Okay.
That's the context that I've gotten so far for the book. What do you think?
I think I really like the idea of the flow distribution as something you're watching with the expectation that it will change over time. Like it's not going to be a constant. And we've been with organizations in the past, and I may or may not be with one right now that has made a proclamation about, say, the defect side of things, like how many defects we're going to be handling. And every time they've said it, I've kind of gone, yeah, that's a hard number. Like
too high,
like
too low.
Well, I would say someday it may be too high. Some days it may be too low. They're not really looking at it as something we're going to report back on. They're going to try and live into it. And that's what's bugging me about it. It's like, well, what if you don't have 30% of this team's capacity to fill with bugs? Are you then going to dig up bugs from elsewhere in the organization so that they come up to capacity? And then they're also saying, and then of course, they need to handle support issues as they come in. And so it's like, this seems like something that would be better served as, by the way, in our sprint review, this was the percentage of defects that we ended up dealing with. This is the versus new work and other things like that, like using that as a lagging indicator rather than as they're attempting to do a leading driver. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. Thoughts?
Yeah, it seems like it's somebody from somewhere this idea emerged that there should be 30% bugs or whatever the number is, high or low.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things I'm struck with is, begin with why. Always start with why. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of this book that talks about putting the business, like business and IT are not separate anymore, right? Software's eating the world. We're all tech companies. And so I guess the question of can you do 30% deaths or bugs is one thing. But before that, where did that number come from? Why do you think you need 30% bugs?
Yeah.
There goes our.
All right. So that's the sound. That's the sound that tells us we're at the end of the time box. All right. So at this point, if we're going to put any amount of structure around this at all, at this point, we would say, are we still finding value in this conversation? Should we continue? Should we continue on?
Impromptu lean coffee. I love it.
There you go. Yeah.
I think so. I feel like
welcome to this agile lean coffee thing
with Mike Markey and Matt Beam. You want to give us another 10 minutes?
Yeah, I'd still find value in this.
Set a timer for 10 minutes. Oh, thank you, Siri.
What would we do without her? So anyway, you were saying
a lot more is what we would do. So how do they know this? Did somebody in the business say, "Hey, can you give me 30% of your capacity to fix defects?" And by the way, that's important because what our customers are telling us is that their experience is it's too buggy, and we're not positioned well versus our competitor, which has a reputation for quality, and so therefore it's less important to do features than to. Remember when Snow Leopard came out? I don't, but apparently when Snow Leopard came out, I don't know. It was 2005 or 6. So Steve Jobs stood on stage and talked. He did the keynote for the new version of Mac OS, and he said, "In this release, we have no new features, 0 new features. It's all bug fixes." And the crowd went nuts because they were sick of reinstalling their printers and whatever. That's a great example of how just fixing the broken stuff can have more value than
sometimes.
Yeah. Definitely. So did the business ask for it? I guess it would be the first question. And then you'd say, okay, are we set up to deliver it?
Yeah, let's go back to the generic because I don't want to talk about any specifics of any one client.
No, these are all,
those are all things that should be considered, right?
Yeah.
So we would potentially so something that might drive somebody to make a large percentage of time or set aside a large percentage of time might be aligned. It's like we have acknowledgement of a lot of defects that we have to contend with. So how are we gonna burn through that?
Yeah.
And so setting aside, so you could have dedicated support teams that only deal with defects, or you need to have your new development teams do some of that stuff too. So and that's where I was struck by let's look at what's the ratios of the types of work: new feature work, defect work, risks that we're dealing with, just right, how are we going to avoid the problems of the future, and then technical debt, refactoring, whatever else fits into that. And it's not just technical, there's other debts too.
It's defined as removing any impediments to future delivery. So architecture, technical, but it's pretty broadly defined, I would say.
Yeah. So I think I actually kind of like the idea that you're kind of looking at it as even if we thought we were going to do this, let's actually reflect on what we actually have as a thing. Because I've worked with teams in the past where, they get hit with a lot of defects in a very short period of time, and it torpedoes their feature development. And then people get angsty about it. Right. And
Yep.
so then you're trying to say, well, what went into that, or what caused that aberration in your behavior? You guys were churning out this much work, and all of a sudden there was this massive fall off. Like, well, there was a reciprocal increase in defects that they had to contend with.
Yeah. Which is one thing if it was intentional, but if you just kind of find yourself in a place where suddenly we're drowning in defects, that's even worse, because it suggests a lack of intentionality that, you didn't even want to work on this many defects, but they came in, and I guess it's a prioritization issue there. Lack of connection to the business to say that's the most valuable thing.
I don't want to take us off this track if we're still on this track, but there is an offshoot from this discussion that we can talk about.
I have one as well. I feel like we've sort of drained this initial thing.
This pond. All right.
Yes, indeed.
I'm with you. So what would you like to say next, or talk about next?
You mentioned the idea of support teams and how to handle support, and I had recently got a question about what is the agile approach to support. I know there's a model at many places that there's support is separated out. And I think the issue that I've seen with that is that a defect comes in, it comes to a support team. The team does support, so they know support stuff, but the defect is about a product, and they didn't write the code for the product. So the first question they have is, what is it supposed to do? Is this a bug? And then if it has to be fixed, then there's a handoff, and that's waste from a lean point of view, right? And so my thought was the pattern that seems to be most effective is the product teams, the stream-aligned teams in the team topology sort of vernacular, would write the production code for the product and also fix it when the defects come in. That's the most efficient way to arrange it. If you've got a flow distribution metric in place, you're not worried that you might have too many bugs unknowingly because you're measuring that all the time. Mm-hmm. But like the simplest thing, if there's a problem with the thing, go to the person who did it, right? They already have the context. They probably wrote the code fairly recently. And all of those handoffs and waiting and transport, like all of that lean waste can just be eliminated. What do you think of that?
I agree. I mean, I've seen both. Now, I've been in some instances where we were doing greenfield development, so we didn't have defects, right? So let's imagine that world. You're just creating and creating and creating, and then you start seeing feedback when it actually gets to customers, and that feedback comes back in the form of unhappiness in some form or another. Sometimes some might call those bugs. Other people we know who would just say it's just more work that has yet to be done. So, but at any rate, this takes your forward momentum and impedes it, right? Because you have to start filling it with rework in a sense, right? So you'll reach a point where that rework, for whatever reason, you hope it doesn't get out of hand. But if, for instance, that distribution of work starts growing and growing and growing, something's wrong with the system. Something is keeping the team from producing at quality. So you want to look at those escape defects and see, how did this get through our net? Should we be doing some additional form of testing? Should we be doing something to close that loop? And so they are, to your point, perfectly situated to do that.
Yeah.
But I've seen organizations have to make the choice at some point that there's too much of this noise coming in, and maybe not even noise that you guys created, but just noise from our history.
Yeah.
There's too much noise coming in that needs to get addressed in one way or another. And it's impeding forward momentum. Our distribution, our flow distribution is too much on the defect side. And so a way of handling that, they needed better predictability moving forward. So what they said was, we're going to form a support team that will handle those issues, because there's so darn many of them. Right. And then that will free up the delivery teams to continue to push forward with their new greenfield delivery. I've taken part in that optimization in the past, but that is opposite of what you just said.
Yeah.
And I've seen it go the other way too, where an organization has taken separation of powers, teams like that, and said, this, it turns out that's not as effective as we thought it was, because our support teams don't have all the context. So they end up bothering the delivery team anyway.
Right. You're delaying the conversation. Yeah,
exactly. So I think, so to that step, yes, I think that is a much better model to do that. I did have somebody, client, where they dissolved the support teams, moved the support back into the individual teams. Individual teams are now doing that. Somebody came to me today even and said, hey, I'm really concerned that we're not doing enough support. They got rid of all the support teams. They're showing no focus on support. I'm like, well, au contraire, there is definitely focus on it. They're trying to understand it. They're trying to prevent it.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to prevent it from having to happen. And so I'm kind of looking at it from the best way to get a developer to focus on quality is to force them to clean up their own mess when they fail to inject it.
I think that's really, that principle I think makes a lot of sense. Not in a punitive way, but just it's more ownership, right? Like if something blows up at 2 a.m., you're getting the call. Yeah. I do think that helps focus the mind.
I think it does. And I said it in the most negative way I could, but to your point, it should not be punitive. It's not a punitive thing.
Yeah.
It's a responsibility thing.
Yeah, there's a couple of thoughts I had number one, when I got this question, I did say, I reflected that same thing you said, right? A defect another way to think about a defect that gets into production is that it's a test that didn't get written. Mm-hmm. That would assume you've got continuous integration or some sort of way of testing that automated, right? So you add to another reason to automate your testing. And so that would create that positive feedback loop where you can drive down the number of defects and it becomes much and much less of support is no longer a huge issue, right? That you have to deal with end of our time box.
Yeah. I know.
The second one is, but like some of the support stuff that comes in isn't going to be code related. So maybe you need sort of a filter front end, right? So the stuff that the product teams never shouldn't be interrupted with in the first place. Like help me with my password reset, right? So that maybe there's a couple of different, maybe this is a little bit too fine grained, but there are
multi levels of support. There's the ones that just a generic password reset's a good one, or, adding users to a system or things like that. Telling somebody, have you tried turning it off and on again? Once you get past that stage, then somebody does some triage on it to understand what it is so it gets shunted to the right work stream.
So that might be a valuable distinction to make for people who think of support as maybe including both of those things. We're splitting them out, right? There's a filtering function. You could call that support, but that's not what we mean when we say putting support in. Putting support with the product teams means anything that requires developer time or testing or whatever the skills are on the team.
Fair. All right.
So we're at the end of this.
I think we've answered that question.
Okay. So I think that was the second time box. Or should we call it? That's a 20-minute show. It's probably.
Well, I want to go for, let's just keep building bricks until we burn up the hour. What do you think?
Set a timer for 10 minutes.
All right. Next topic.
Yes.
And it's related to the other two in this, the sizing of defects. Because if you are going to be measuring your distribution of defects, your flow distribution of defects, what are you measuring them as? How do you know what the impact is on your velocity? And so I have frequently been of the opinion that you really can't size a defect.
I come from this school
in the
as
same
well.
way that you do, in the same way that you can size a story, because defects are really as much of a hunt as anything else, and you can't tell how long the hunt is. And the joke is that the bug is always in the last place you look.
Along with my keys.
Exactly. It's right there with your keys. If we just knew where the keys were, we could find the bugs.
Why don't you just look at the... Okay, anyway, whatever. Yeah.
Point being, now we've got these systems that we're setting up where we've got teams that may set aside a certain amount of their capacity for support. How much support fits into that bucket? And that is where the nuance of this comes in. And so whereas my hardline approach has been, you don't size bugs, it seems that is an incompatible stance in this model.
I think you're right. I don't know that I've heard this. I'm going to guess what Mick Kirsten would say was, whatever. You can use story points. You can use throughput. It's probably easier to just make all the stories as small as possible and count them for throughput, and then just do the same thing for bugs as much as you can and say, there's going to be some variation, but it's going to come out in the wash, right? It's, at a certain point, it's statistically, it's not going to be significant. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's a good point. So I think that's a good point, but the problem that you're looking at there is, again, those defects. Just because you made small features doesn't mean you made a small bug.
Can you split bugs out to the right size bugs? I've never heard anybody talk about that. Right sizing your bugs.
I think it. I don't like big bugs.
And I cannot lie.
I cannot lie.
I'm comfortable with that.
So the way that I've taken to answering that question now, because the development types will come to you and say, how am I supposed to put a size on an unknowable thing?
Totally valid question.
And I remember, I look back to my development days and say, what did we used to do when we would receive a bug? Because we needed to have some idea of the impact. And so someone had to do an initial assessment of the defect and see if they could find, is it small? Is there a quick answer to this? Or this was Joe's problem. Joe, can you guess what this might be? And Joe looks at and he goes, oh yeah, I know what that is. Don't worry, it's a one-line change. I can fix that real easy. So then we know it's small, right? But there were always those ones that we couldn't do that, right? You would look at that and go, well, that's in the spaghetti zone, and we can't predict what's going to happen in there. In fact, we're probably going to break 3 or 4 things in the act of even trying to fix this thing.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at a career defining problem there. So somewhere between a half and the rest of our lives on some of these defects. So what I've said to the team is said, all right, so in that situation, what you could do is look back historically, how much effort have we put into many of our defects? On average, we spend 2-3 points on the equivalent amount of effort of a 2 or 3 point story on our defects.
I love this idea.
To do that, right?
I love
and
this
then you
idea.
just say, by default, if we can't give you a better number, this will be the number we give you, and then start working on it based on that, and come back and let us know if something changes.
This reminds me a lot of Daniel Vacanti's work, where he says, okay, the approach that a lot of people say is you estimate stuff and then you make a plan on that, and you're wrong because it's an estimate. What he recommends you do is take a look at your data. You've done a bunch of these things. Mm-hmm. how long on average does it take? And make a projection or a forecast based on the actual cycle time data of your work items, assuming you're breaking stuff down to more or less the same size. That you're doing it based on actual data as opposed to a guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the best you can do in this situation. But I mean, there's still a certain amount of unknowns to that. And and so let's say we did that. So let's say we just threw a 3 onto this defect. We knew nothing better, so we called it a 3. We started working on it. Now we get to the end and we're now going to worry about our defect distribution. Mm-hmm. We thought it was a 3 when it came in. Now that we've seen it and we've squashed it, how do you go back and alter it? Do you go back and alter it? Do you go back and say, it turns out that would have been more like an 8? You're shaking your head?
I think no. I'm going to say no. And it's the same. I think it's the same principle as when on Scrum teams say the story was a 5. Should we go back? Basically, it's the idea of truing up your projected versus your actuals. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My approach to that has always been, these are wild ass guesses to begin with. You're never really going to get that good at estimate. And I haven't done a deep dive into estimation. Like maybe you could get good, but my thing has always been, it's not worth your time to try to true it up because your estimates only have to be so precise anyway. And it's not very precise. And so,
yeah, I mean, it's not going to help you in the future.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Okay. Next time I see a bug in this area, now you might end up like, as I alluded to with the spaghetti zone, that module is a million lines of undocumented spaghetti code.
Yeah.
Right. Which somebody retired on.
Right. As opposed instead of having to fix it.
Yeah. And so now we have to contend with it. And so we would know that, okay, a bug, there be dragons in there, right? So if there's a bug in there, odds are that is going to be the only thing we look at.
That's the thing. As you go along and you estimate and you retrospect each iteration or sprint or whatever, you'll naturally learn about stuff. So you'll get better at estimating anyway, just because you get more familiar. But I was just talking about this time specifically. Let's set aside an hour to look at what we thought the estimate was versus what we would say it is now. That time is probably wasted. But I do think teams get better at estimating just because they learn and they get more familiar. And so it takes care of itself, basically.
Yeah. So there's okay.
So I had one more thing. Defects. So you're talking about trying to understand the defect, the flow distribution of defects, and does it get too big? At some point, if the defects are becoming too big, do you have a debt issue? Right? Should you, are
if you can't keep up with it, then yeah.
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting at. These situations where there's so much defect stuff. Typically in that situation, there would be an architectural or some sort of debt somewhere that's causing all this, because like these systems are all sort of, you can have a system where there's basically the feedback loops are so great that no defects get into production. And when they do, we fix them immediately, right? Extremely healthy, versus the other end of the spectrum where there's so much architectural debt. There's so much chaos. We can't see, you put something out, it breaks 5 more things. Right. It's extremely unhealthy. Right. So you'll have to, it strikes me there's a relationship between defects and debts there that I don't know what that would be, but the relationship exists.
Yeah. But I mean, unless you're looking at it, you're never going to find it. So
yeah,
it seems like in the right situation, you may uncover a relationship there.
Yeah. And then that would, let you project what to do. Huh. So that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Anything else?
There, look at all this world peace we're solving.
Yeah, you're welcome, everybody.
So let's see. Other things I jotted down as we talked through this. You mentioned CI/CD. Don't know if I want to go there. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned cycle times, which I would consider going there. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, you mentioned risk, and so this recalls a discussion that happened recently on sizing, trying to get teams away from sizing on time. and thinking about, well, the three aspects that really that go into a piece of work or an estimation really should have more like complexity and risk and time, right? So new topic.
Re-up? Should we go again?
No, I think it's a new topic. I think it's now,
But so we should continue
10
that,
new
right?
minutes. Well, it's 10 new minutes. And
set a timer for 10 minutes.
Okay. So our topic now has to do with estimation, since we talked about estimating bugs. This question has come up because developers or development teams have been sizing in time for so long.
Yeah.
And they come back to me and say, and we tell them, no, you're not doing that now. And we'll get into a cross-functional estimations session, and the developers go, oh, it's really easy. And the testers go, yeah, that's pretty easy. And then everyone throws out twos. And it's like, now hold on a second. You said it was really easy. I said, yeah. So it's like a point for the developer and a point for the tester. And I'm just like, okay, no. Think of it more like a max function. So if it's a 1 and a 1, it's a 1.
Right. The highest value wins.
And that they pause. They said, well, that doesn't track because we were told that a point was like a day and 2 points was like a day and a half. And I'm like, well, okay, right there, your relative scale is blasted. So
also,
let's
the
never do that
is,
again.
Yeah. The abstraction is useless because you might as well just say days instead of points.
Yeah. And then it got even worse because one of them said, well, if I did it, it would be a 1, but if they do it, it's a 2.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, gonna get you off that one too. Right. So, but what I ended up settling on was 3 factors that they could consider when doing sizing. And I don't think I'm unique in saying this. I ended up saying complexity, risk, and time. Like
complexity, risk, and
effort. Complexity, risk, and effort. Right.
So what's interesting about these is none of these have what's the word I'm looking for? Objective units of measurement, right? Mm-hmm. They're all relative. They're all, I guess, subjective. Would that be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So complexity, there's a lot to it. There's a lot of interlocking parts, whatever. So a lot to keep in your head. Risk would be you're dealing with the brittle spaghetti zone, right?
Yeah.
And effort is, again, that how much work does it feel like?
Yeah.
Right. So if you took those 3 aspects, and so any one of those could cause, I always used to say, well, size for effort, but tweak for complexity or risk. Like so bump. So yeah. I feels like this is what we would normally call a 3, but it's in spaghetti zone. So I'm bumping it up an extra 2, something along those lines.
Yeah. I like that.
Right. So there was one organization that I worked at. They were trying to streamline their estimation to such an extent, and their Jira had been set up so that it tracked individual ratings for complexity, risk, and effort.
That's probably too much detail, isn't it?
Well, but what they ended up doing was saying, and it asked you for low, medium, high. It didn't ask for a number.
Okay.
Right. So then what they ended up doing is they had a table that translated the 3 low, medium, highs into a size.
It's almost like it reminds me of WSGIF or other prioritization things where you are doing a little bit of math to sort of spread the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that works. I think that works if you are in the situation that you alluded to earlier, where you're making small changes or you're trying to keep everything about the same size.
Yeah.
Now you could look at, well, yeah, it's this conceptual unit, but it is compounded by a high complexity or a low effort or something, and then so in that situation, then saying, yeah, our table says this should be marked as a 3, or our table says this one should be marked as a 5. Right.
Yeah.
I could see doing that. But I would prefer, instead of it being a table, that everyone just sort of like does that in their head. You know,
that was my pushback on when I said it seems complicated. It does. The thing is always like, do people have that mental model in their head when they're estimating, right? There might be some value in breaking it out to the detail level like that to say, here's how to think about it, right?
Yeah.
But maybe it's a training exercise. And then after that, we just go, okay, using our existing model, everybody knows about it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So keeping the model in mind. But you're always going to get the people who are maybe visual, who like the table. You're going to get the people who like rules and see that as an inviolable act of definition.
Yeah. And maybe having sort of an artifact on the wall of the room you never go into physically anymore, just to say, here's the reference. Okay, how do we estimate? We do this.
Yeah.
All the rule followers can relax, and the other people,
Yeah. So maybe, I mean, it'd be interesting to see if that actually worked, because when you get right down to it, you're not the size estimates really shouldn't be translating to, well, this story is going to take 25% of our sprint, right? It should be how much of this work are we getting out? Yeah. And then of course, then you're getting into a completely different conversation if you start talking about effort versus value. Like, what's the value of the story versus the amount, how big it is.
Yeah, and the remaining 3 minutes and 46 seconds in our time box, we probably don't have room for that. But that's probably a pretty good topic to go into. That feels like a prioritization topic or part of a prioritization discussion. Yeah.
Could be,
yeah.
All right. So I'll call Elmo on this one.
That's the end of this agile thing.
Excellent.
Thanks everybody for joining. What's our sign off? Go ahead. I just interrupted your sign off.
What is our sign off? Thanks everybody for attending this agile thing. I have been Mike Markey, and he has been Matt Beam.
Pretty consistently.
And we will attempt to do that again at some point in the future. Join us next time, and we'll talk about such things as, I don't know.
Also, when to use your radio voice and when not to use your radio voice.
I like the radio voice, but I can't just keep doing it all the time.
I know it does have it's like what am I thinking of? Profanity. It's useful in small fucking chunks.